So I recently made a short video breaking down an idea for a mechanic that detects and traces random crimes in a potential Daredevil game. People seem to like that idea, so I decided to expand on it with a concept for how a full Daredevil game could play and work. If you haven't seen that video, I'll leave a link in the description, but I'll also recap it as part of the features in this video as well. Before we get started, I just want to say thanks for taking the time to check out this video today, and if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, I really appreciate it and it helps me bring better content to you guys. Let's get into it. With any game, the first thing that you need to know is the setting. Everything is built up from there. The story, how the character interacts with the world, the challenges they face, and so on. And Matt Murdock, like Spider-Man, is a New Yorker. So could this potentially be the fourth superhero game set in New York in recent years after Spider-Man 2? Could that potentially become tedious from a gameplay perspective, seeing the same location again and again, regardless of how much narrative sense it makes for the character? Well, that's certainly a risk if you simply copy and paste the map from the Spider-Man games and repurpose it for Daredevil, and I don't think that's the approach that they should take, assuming it was made by Insomniac Games. Whereas the map in Spider-Man 2 is going to be double the size of its predecessors, scaling up Manhattan as well as adding new locations such as Queens, Brooklyn, Coney Island and potentially more, I think the playable space in a Daredevil game should actually be smaller. Smaller but denser. More claustrophobic, more atmospheric. Not every game needs to be an enormous Ubisoft-sized map. Sometimes less is more. A smaller map can mean greater detail, increased immersion, and more ways to interact with the world around you as a player. Think of it almost like a swimming pool. You can have a very wide pool that's shallow and allows you to swim lengths, or you could have a pool with a smaller surface area, but it's much deeper and allows you to dive in. It's two completely different experiences. Now, Daredevil is of course most often associated with a specific part of Manhattan, Hell's Kitchen. And despite everything I just said, I think reducing the playable space to just Hell's Kitchen is a little too small. It's roughly 24 blocks, which isn't much. Makes up just one small district in the original Spider-Man map. For a character as acrobatic and agile as Daredevil, the playable space still needs to be big enough to make traversal interesting. He might not be quite as fast as Spider-Man, but he still needs a playground. I think Hell's Kitchen and a few surrounding neighborhoods would be enough. Probably around half the size of the original Spider-Man map. It might seem strange to want a smaller map, considering that Daredevil is almost as capable as Spider-Man when it comes to staying off the ground, but I think having a more intimate connection with the street level adds to that groundedness. You can have greater detail in alleyways, windows, storefronts, citizens that are even more reactive and authentic, a place that feels genuinely lived in, and that's easier to do when you have a smaller playable area. A great comparison would be the markets of Sleeping Dogs, which captured the hustle and bustle of a community. It felt like real people going about their business. Daredevil can hear far more than a normal person, so the ambience of the environment needs to reflect that, and it has to feel tangible. In open world superhero games, the majority of your time is spent moving around the world, so the importance of fun and engaging traversal can't be understated. With that smaller, more intimate setting comes the opportunity for greater emphasis on parkour and environmental interaction. Daredevil can't just stick to any surface. He relies on climbing and parkour, vaults, leaps, flips, wall runs, and of course his retractable billy club. So there are elements of multiple games that I would take inspiration from for Daredevil's traversal. Assassin's Creed has always managed to make their movement feel relatively realistic for non-superpowered characters, while still allowing you to pull off incredible, impossible feats while suspending your disbelief. After all, it is a video game and we're talking about fictional characters. In the case of Daredevil, literally a comic book superhero. Daredevil breaking his leg falling from 20 feet wouldn't make for fun gameplay, but at the same time, he is still human, and an element of danger and the possibility of making a mistake adds to the thrill. This game would require fall damage. You can get away with not doing it in Spider-Man, but you can't do that here. The clue is in the name, Daredevil. What he does is inherently dangerous, jumping from rooftop to rooftop, where one mistake could mean falling to his death. That's what makes it so exhilarating and impressive in the first place, that he does all this as a normal human being. What if you don't quite make that jump? well, when you do pull it off by the skin of your teeth, knowing that if you hadn't made it, it was game over, that's more rewarding than knowing you could just hit the ground and keep going. What makes Spider-Man's traversal fun is the complete freedom to go anywhere you want, but what would make Daredevil's fun is the challenge of finding the best, most efficient and most stylish way to get where you need to go. As a player, you feel more engaged in a system that pushes you to think and take risks. Assassin's Creed Unity is the baseline philosophy for how I'd imagine Daredevil to move in his game. Fast, fluid, acrobatic, and most importantly, fearless. And although it appears almost automated on the surface, you do have a lot of manual control over how you ascend and descend, vault over objects, slide, eject from walls, and swing from lights and poles. Combining the freedom of Unity with the impressive animations and finesse of Watch Dogs 2, you could flip, spin, and dive across Hell's Kitchen in style. But I would definitely need a manual jump button, which the Ubisoft games don't offer. And of course, Daredevil doesn't just use parkour. His main weapon and tool is his extendable billy club, which conceals a retractable cord, allowing him to swing almost as well as Spider-Man. And it's an iconic aspect of the character. But if you can swing anywhere you want, as much as you want, the game essentially becomes Spider-Man at that point. I think there is actually a benefit in slightly restricting when and where the billy club swing can be used, because then when you do use it, it feels more satisfying and rewarding to pull off. It should enhance traversal rather than being a primary mode of movement. Unlike webs, it can't just stick to anything, you need something to grapple onto. And that's where the influence from Uncharted 4 would come in. The grapple mechanic in that game was awesome. It felt weighty and visceral, and it was integrated into the environment just the right amount that you couldn't rely on it constantly, but when you do use it, it's a rush. In an open world space like New York, having grapple and swing points in most areas that can't be cleared by a single leap or jump makes the most sense. You should be able to use it often enough that it feels as though parkour and swinging are completely interwoven and seamless. The result would feel like the balance that Dying Light 2 has struck, but in third person. You would get a sense of speed and control tempered by a risk factor where one mistake can actually have consequences. In the same way that traversal has to be adapted to Daredevil's non-superpowered nature, the same's true for combat. He doesn't have super strength, but he is one of the most skilled hand-to-hand fighters in the Marvel Universe. I would have the game start with Daredevil's Man Without Fear costume, just like the Netflix series. A simple black top and pants, rope hand wraps, and a mask. Early in the game, it would be difficult to take on large groups of enemies, forcing the player to rely more on stealth, which we'll cover in more detail later. But as you progress, Daredevil's costume and weapon improve, giving him greater resistance, and that extra survivability would allow you to take a more direct combat approach if you want to, as well as developing Daredevil as a character narratively through the gameplay, coming out of the shadows as a vigilante and more into the role of a true superhero. Nightwing's combat in Gotham Knights and the Arkham games is a great place to start for inspiration on how Daredevil would move and attack, as they're both very similar in terms of ability and choice of weapon. But in terms of the actual combat system itself, something like Slow Clap's Sifu seems much more authentic and raw, especially if you want to capture that grittiness from the Netflix series. Sifu also has something that the Arkham and Spider-Man games tend to lack. It's genuinely quite difficult. Going back to what I was saying earlier, Daredevil isn't superhuman in terms of physical strength. Yes, he's extremely skilled, he has heightened senses which give him near superhuman reflexes, but he can't believably fight with 16 broken bones. He can't heal rapidly. So that added difficulty to the moment-to-moment combat with even groups of the most standard enemies posing a threat sets him apart and is a representation of that human vulnerability. The smaller environment with increased detail could also allow for environmental takedowns similar to Sleeping Dogs, which also had an excellent and very gritty, brutal combat system. Stealth was a fairly basic and underwhelming aspect of the Spider-Man games. It served its purpose and it added just enough to break up the pace of the game, but I don't feel that's enough for Daredevil. His vulnerability, especially early on, would practically necessitate stealth. His enhanced hearing also serves as a perfect base for something like Eagle Vision or Detective Mode, or even better, the listening mechanic from The Last of Us. It makes sense to be able to eavesdrop on enemies, hearing heartbeats, footsteps, and even useful conversations that can reveal information to use to your advantage through the ground and walls, and it would give the player insight into how Daredevil visualizes the world around him. A lot of inspiration here could be taken directly from the Arkham series, being able to perch on gargoyles and ledges, hide in vents and grates, take cover behind walls and around corners, and create distractions by throwing the billy club to instill fear in the enemy. You could have a wide variety of enemy types based on the factions within New York, and I don't think you can have a Daredevil game without the hand, so you could have extremely dangerous ninja type enemies. In my previous Daredevil video, I broke down how detecting random crimes could work. You would press a button on the D-pad to focus Daredevil's hearing, which would reduce the ambient sound in the city and highlight the sound of a nearby crime. The closer you get to the crime, the louder and clearer it becomes. Here's an example of how it would look and sound in-game. I think this is a much more engaging system for the player, as well as an accurate and immersive depiction of how Daredevil operates. I liked how crimes in Gotham Knights worked. They were closely tied to villain cases, and as you dismantled a villain operation, it felt like it was actually having an impact. That could work very well here, and I'll touch on this in the next section, but assuming this game was to be made by Insomniac, I'd love Kingpin to be a major player in the story and have it be set before the events of Spider-Man 1. So with that in mind, here's how I'd structure the random crimes around villain case files. One of the main activities in the game would be court cases. Matt is obviously a lawyer, and I feel that aspect of his persona needs to be explored for a game about Daredevil to feel authentic. As Daredevil, you can complete hideouts, random crimes, investigations, and take down operations such as drug shipments at dockyards and so on. And as you complete these activities against, say, Kingpin's men for example, you ensure that the information gleaned from interrogations, documents, witness statements, and overheard conversations legally finds its way to Nelson and Murdoch, who can then use it to build a court case. Once you've gathered enough evidence to take down a villain, you take part in an actual courtroom sequence, where you have to ensure you deliver your case properly. You cross-examine witnesses and have to use the correct questions, statements, and identify liars, essentially like Ace Attorney or LA Noire. This would change up the pace in a similar way to the MJ missions in Spider-Man, but in a unique way that highlights the alter ego of the main character. As you complete court cases for various side villains and have them sent to the raft, you would see their influence reduce in New York. I'm not going to go into too much detail for this part because there's a mountain of Daredevil history to dig into. There's many popular runs and arcs that could be adapted, and everyone's got their favourites. So for just some bullet points, like I said, I'd like this game to be set before Spider-Man 1 if it was developed by Insomniac, with Kingpin being the main villain, and the story set around Daredevil's mission to bring him down. We could cross paths with a younger, more inexperienced Peter Parker in his early career, and maybe even team up with him for a mission or two. It would be awesome to see characters like Elektra and Punisher show up as well, and I think Matt's apartment and the Nelson and Murdoch office would be a great hub where you can rest and talk to characters like Foggy, similar to Feast in Spider-Man but more personal. Having a board where you can connect the dots about the various cases as the game progresses would be awesome. Maybe towards the end of the game it skips ahead a few years and we see that Daredevil was an instrumental part in orchestrating Kingpin's arrest at the start of Spider-Man 1, and that would tie things together nicely. That about wraps up my thoughts on Marvel's Daredevil, but as always, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you add? What would you do differently? Would you rather Daredevil be developed by a different studio and not Insomniac? And not connected to Insomniac's universe? If so, which developer and why? Don't forget to drop a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one, and as always, have a great day wherever you are.